What happened to Thomas and Timothy Henderson in the winter of 1851 wasn't a medical anomaly. It was a controlled descent into madness, manufactured by those who claimed to heal. But they weren't doctors. They were architects of psychological experiments so brutal, so surgical, that even the Confederate institutions chose silence over truth. Why? Because if this story is true, and I'm telling you it is, then everything we believe about medicine, free will, and human identity begins to collapse. These weren't just two men with fragile minds. These were twin vessels, born into blood-soaked privilege, primed since childhood to be the perfect specimens. And someone with power and purpose, decided it was time to test how far the mind could bend before it breaks. This wasn't about healing. It was about control, replication, mastery over human consciousness itself. But here's the secret no one once whispered. What broke inside the Henderson twins wasn't just their sanity. It was something deeper, something older, something buried beneath centuries of elite experimentation, rooted not in medicine but in domination. What they endured was not an accident. It was a ritual. And the man who orchestrated it, Dr. Cornelius Hartwell. A name you've never heard because history erased him on purpose. But once you know what he did, you'll understand why. Because Hartwell didn't just study the mind, he attempted to rewrite it. This is your warning. You're stepping into the shadows of American history, where science, slavery, and secrecy intersected in the unholiest ways imaginable. And when we're done here, you won't look at your reflection the same way again. You've heard of evil men, but Jeremiah Henderson wasn't evil in the way you've been taught. He didn't laugh maniacally. He didn't torture for pleasure. He smiled while he did it, for profit, for progress, and for something far more calculated: legacy. The Henderson plantation, 800 acres of rich Virginia soil, was more than just a tobacco empire. It was a machine, efficient, silent, and brutal. And deep in that machine's gears were the bodies of 43 enslaved men and women. You've seen slavery taught as brutality, but you haven't seen it taught like this, as infrastructure for medical experimentation. Because behind the mansion's white pillars and wraparound porches was a slaughterhouse disguised as science. Here's what they don't teach in your history books. Jeremiah had a deal, not just with buyers, with institutions, universities, the Medical College of Virginia. When one of his assets grew too old, too injured, or too curious about the wrong locked door in the cellar, he didn't sell them south. He sold them dead. Cadavers, anatomical specimens, research material. You see, science needed bodies, and the South provided them. But Jeremiah didn't wait for death. He made it happen. At first, it was discreet: disease victims, old age. Then it grew. He learned to preserve the bodies, keep them fresh, market ready. $20 a corpse became $50, more than a month's labor from the very people he sold. And when he ran low on natural deaths, he created them, with poison, with neglect, with forced accidents that ensured nobody would talk. The profits, staggering. The morals, irrelevant. This wasn't just survival. This was business as science. Now think about what kind of father raises two sons inside that world. Thomas and Timothy didn't just inherit land. They inherited methodology, observation, participation. By age 12, they had watched a man die from slow arsenic exposure to just to see what it did to his nervous system. By 15, they could drain a body and pack it for transport like trained morticians. By 20, they weren't students. They were practitioners. They didn't feel guilt. They felt legacy. They weren't hiding secrets. They were the secrets. And that's what made them perfect for what came next. They were blank slates, with no conscience left to cloud the data. The Henderson twins weren't broken by experiments. They were built for them. Dr. Cornelius Hartwell arrived in Richmond in 1850, like a ghost no one had summoned, but everyone feared. He didn't knock. He entered, with a reputation forged in scandal and a silence purchased in blood. He came from Philadelphia, bearing papers and titles, but also whispers of patients who screamed in locked rooms, whispers of treatments that left men drooling wrecks, or worse, grinning like puppets with dead eyes. But Hartwell wasn't a madman. He was a visionary in a world not ready for what he saw. To him, the human mind was not a mystery. It was a code, a system, something that could be reprogrammed if you just applied the right pressure, the right drug, the right trauma. He didn't see patients, he saw variables. And when he found the Henderson twins, he saw perfection, identical biology, shared upbringing, controlled environment, no moral interference. If ever there were a human experiment waiting to happen, it was them. Hartwell believed in three things: that personality was chemical, that willpower could be surgically modified, that twins were the closest thing humanity had to natural control groups. He'd pitched these ideas in northern medical circles, and they laughed him out of their salons. But Richmond? Richmond welcomed darkness as long as it dressed like progress. The Medical College of Virginia gave him a lab, no oversight, no ethics board, just silence and steel tables, and Hartwell got to work. His plan was simple and monstrous. One twin would be exposed to a compound he'd synthesized based on opiates, mercury, and an experimental nerve agent derived from a plant he refused to name. The other twin would remain untouched. And he would watch. He would study. He would learn what the world had no right to know, how to dismantle a human identity, one neuron at a time. The Hendersons agreed, not reluctantly, willingly. Because I thought they were in control. That their lineage, founded on the control of others, made them immune to manipulation. But Hartwell didn't want their minds. He wanted what was beneath their minds, and he knew exactly how to reach it. It began with a smell. Sweet, metallic, familiar in a way Timothy couldn't place, but his body recoiled even before his mind could form the fear. That was Hartwell's compound, a clear liquid with a faint yellow tint, administered through inhalation. The first dose was small, subtle, meant to ease open the door between consciousness and suggestion, and it worked. Within 3 days, Timothy reported unusual dreams. Vivid sequences involving doors that led to nothing, voices speaking in reverse, and a shadowy figure wearing his face but standing slightly wrong. Hartwell noted everything. Thomas, meanwhile, remained untouched, observing, taking notes, his scientific detachment still intact, still above it. But the changes came fast. Timothy's sleep cycles collapsed, his appetite disappeared. He began to speak in fragments, unfinished sentences about the roots in the mirror, the man with no skin, and something he called the second birth. And yet, no fear, no panic, just calm, an eerie stillness that chilled even the hardened staff. But this wasn't madness. Hartwell insisted on that. This was reconstruction. The compound, he argued, didn't destroy, it revealed. It peeled back the learned personality to expose something older, deeper, truer. But what Timothy began to describe didn't sound human. He claimed to remember things no man could, being buried alive beneath the earth, breathing water that tasted like fire, and watching people from inside their eyes. When asked who he was, he responded, not the first, not the last, just the one who woke up. Hartwell's eyes lit up. He believed he was close to something no man had achieved, a chemical access point to what religion called the soul, what psychology calls the subconscious, and what ancient cults called the knowing self. But here's where it turned, because Thomas began exhibiting symptoms without ever receiving a dose. He began hearing the same voices, seeing the same dreams, and he began resenting them, not just the visions, but his brother. Because now, for the first time in their lives, Timothy was seeing something Thomas could not, and that meant power was shifting. The twin who had always watched from the shadows was now being watched by something neither of them understood, something older than medicine, and far less merciful. By the 7th week, the brothers no longer looked alike. Timothy's face had grown sharper, as if carved by something from the inside. His pupils dilated constantly, even in bright light. His voice lost its softness. It wasn't deeper, it was emptier. He spoke not just in sentences, but rituals. Words repeated like echoes of something ancient trying to remember itself. Thomas, who had once prided himself on control, logic, and moral distance, began unraveling. It started with the mirror. He swore Timothy's reflection didn't match his movements. that sometimes the mirror version of his brother blinked too late, or smiled when the real one didn't. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and worst of all, he stopped believing in observation. He wrote in his journal, "Timothy is not changing, the room is, the house is. I think I may be the one being studied now." But he didn't tell Hartwell, not at first, because something in him still needed to believe he was immune, that his mind, forged in logic and superiority, couldn't be broken, but the cracks deepened. One morning, Thomas awoke in his study, fingernails torn and bloody. A series of symbols had been scratched into the wood floor beneath him, perfect spirals, aligned like constellations, his handwriting, his knife. He had no memory of doing it. That night, he confronted Timothy. "You've let something in," he whispered. "Whatever this is, it's wearing your body." Timothy smiled, not cruelly, not joyfully, just knowingly. And he replied, "You speak as if the door was closed before." Hartwell, of course, dismissed it all as projection, a side effect of proximity. He insisted the compound could not transmit through air, contact, or thought, but Thomas knew better. It wasn't the compound, it was the pattern, the rhythm of the house, the humming in the walls, the rituals written into their days by Hartwell's. Quiet, relentless routines. They were not participants in a study anymore. They were participants in a ceremony, and something had already RSVP'd. Something not born of man, science, or God. Something that had been waiting for twins. Hartwell was a man of formulas. Everything he built, every chamber, every injection, every whisper behind a one-way mirror was rooted in logic, until now. Because Timothy had stopped speaking entirely, yet somehow the house was filled with his voice. It started in the ducts. A low hum that matched the frequency of the boy's breath. Maintenance workers complained of hearing their own names in the static. Lights dimmed near his room. Mice died in the walls. And every time Hartwell stepped into Timothy's presence, his wristwatch froze. Not slowed, froze. The glass fogged, the hands reversed, and then, without reason, time resumed. That's when Hartwell began dreaming too. But his were different. He wasn't chased or haunted. He was dissected, layer by layer, by gloved hands that looked like his own. Behind him stood a child, not Timothy, not Thomas, a third figure, genderless, pale, watching him with a stare that knew more than he'd ever learned. He stopped logging his findings. He stopped eating meat. He couldn't look at mirrors. And the worst part? He felt ashamed, as if he'd desecrated something sacred. Thomas tried to confront him again, this time armed with pages of fevered notes, overlapping symbols and journal entries he didn't remember writing. "He's not my brother anymore," Thomas said, eyes hollow. "He's wearing a body, but it's not his." Hartwell snapped. "You're projecting. You want to be him. You resent that he has become more." But Thomas shook his head. "No, I resent that he's not done becoming." For the first time in his life, Hartwell didn't know what experiment he was in. The variables were shifting. The control group was collapsing. The subject was becoming the scientist. The house itself, the lab, felt less like architecture and more like a vessel. Timothy, they realized, hadn't been altered. He had been activated. The compound hadn't created a reaction. It had responded to something already there, something inherited, buried, or summoned by a lineage deeper than family trees. Twins, mirrors, reflections, one body waking the other. And somewhere, in the heart of that house, another presence stirred, older than any of them, rooted not in science but in design. A ritual centuries in motion, and they had just spoken its name aloud. Thomas began to draw. He didn't know why. The urge came suddenly, without sleep, without conscious thought. At first it was harmless, spirals, circles, symbols from the margins of medical books, then older ones, carvings he'd never seen but somehow remembered. Pages filled with what looked like maps, but not of places. They were diagrams of events. Timothy's silence continued. His skin had taken on a pale, parchment tone, veins more visible, fingernails darkening, but he wasn't deteriorating. He was shedding. Hartwell, obsessed again, compared Thomas's drawings to everything in his private archive. He uncovered something that made his blood run cold, an 18th-century woodcut from rural Bavaria, depicting twin boys standing beside a figure with no face. Behind them, symbols identical to Thomas's sketches. Not similar, identical, right down to the curvature of the ink. The carving was titled in Latin, Speculum Fractum, the broken mirror. Hartwell dug further. In obscure European texts, banned, burned, forgotten, he found stories, folk tales, warnings. Always twins, always the same structure. One boy changed, one boy witnessed, one figure awakened, and always the same ending. The witness was erased, not killed, erased. No records, no graves. The surviving twin would prosper, sometimes impossibly, becoming a prophet, a leader, a man with powers no one could explain. Thomas didn't need the texts. He knew it now, knew what Timothy had become. "He's not my brother," he said to Hartwell, voice hollow. "He's the vessel. I was the trigger. This house is the mirror. And you're the key that turned it all." Hartwell, for once, said nothing, because the drawings had begun appearing in his own handwriting. Pages he didn't remember writing, in a dialect he didn't know, symbols in blood, his blood. The walls of the lab, painted and repainted, started revealing the S.A.E. patterns beneath the surface like they'd been there before the Hendersons ever arrived. Before he ever arrived. It wasn't the experiment that caused this. It was the act of observing it, of naming it, of watching something that was never meant to be seen, and it was watching them back. On the 11th night, the floorboards began to bleed. Not metaphorically, literally. Thick, rust-dark rivulets pooled at the base of the staircase. Hartwell knelt, fingers trembling as he dipped them into the liquid. It wasn't paint, not ink, not some alchemical trick. It was blood. Human. Type O negative. He ran tests in his lab, the same lab where he'd dissected identity, memory, and belief like tissue under glass. And yet, for all his methods, he couldn't explain the one thing he now witnessed: bleeding pine. Even more terrifying, it wasn't in the wood. It was coming from beneath the house. Thomas, once so rational, so articulate, began speaking in tongues, but not religious ones. This wasn't scripture, it was something older, a dialect no linguist had catalogued, with rhythmic inflections that echoed numbers more than words, like coordinates, like invocations. Timothy no longer moved, but he was always somewhere new, one moment in the study, then the attic, then the cellar. No one ever saw him walk. But he was always standing, always facing a wall, and every wall he faced began to peel, revealing symbols. In Hartwell's journal that week, one entry stood out, circled in charcoal. He is possessed, not by a demon, but by a pattern. The house is decoding me. Servants fled, rats returned, mirrors cracked, and in the reflection no one ever saw themselves, only the opposite twin. Thomas would see Timothy, Timothy would see Thomas. Hartwell would see a child version of himself, staring with eyes wide and black as coal. Then came the dreams. Recurring, relentless, shared among them. Always the same setting, a burning chapel beneath the earth, filled with pews of bone and robed figures without faces. A choir of voices whispering a date, August 13th, again and again. It wasn't in the past, it was approaching. Thomas stopped drawing and began carving, into doors, into his skin, into Hartwell's books. Everything was marked now, branded with shapes that didn't just resemble letters. They summoned something when you looked too long. And Timothy? He began to smile, but not with his mouth, with his presence. He could be behind you, and you'd feel it in your organs before your eyes caught up, as if space itself bent to accommodate him. Something had awakened, not inside the twins, but through them, and it wanted to remember. Dr. Hartwell began to lose time. Not in the poetic sense, but chunks of hours, entire days, simply vanished from his journals. He would awaken in different clothes, hands stained with ink, or sometimes with blood he couldn't trace. His notes would contain entries he didn't recall writing, detailed diagrams of the twins' brains, anatomical impossibilities, dream language decoded into geometric spirals, and one phrase kept recurring: memory is the enemy of control. Hartwell set traps to catch his own shadow, mirrors in corners, ropes at doors, powder across the floorboards, but what he discovered was worse than trespass. It was internal rebellion. He had begun sleepwalking, speaking aloud in the same unrecorded tongue as the twins, muttering patterns, shapes, instructions. In one instance, he awoke outside, half buried in the soil near the rosewood tree, his hands raw from digging. In the shallow pit was a tin box containing a child's tooth, and a drawing of himself, standing over the twins, holding a rusted key. The twins had stopped eating, yet they did not weaken. Hartwell fed them broth, bread, dried meat, but none of it vanished from the plates, and yet their muscles grew denser, their skin grew tighter. They no longer blinked, not once in over 48 hours. Thomas's right eye turned black, fully, as if the pupil had swallowed the iris. He claimed to see things under the world, shapes with names older than English, older than sound. Timothy began humming. Every hour, on the hour. The same slow, ascending tone. It vibrated through the wood, disturbed the dogs, cracked a porcelain teacup from across the room. When Hartwell recorded it on wax cylinder, the playback produced not humming, but whispers. Overlapping voices, one of them unmistakably his own, uttering, "The house was never built, it was found." And the neighbors had begun to notice. Children Refn used to walk past the property. Mail was no longer delivered. A pastor from Richmond sent a letter of warning, unsigned, reading only, "You are housing a spiritual fracture. They are not boys, they are not yours. They are the echo of something that was supposed to stay buried." On the 19th night, Hartwell found a noose hanging from the rafters. Fresh rope, no dust, centered above his bed. He didn't scream. He simply wrote in his journal, "It wants me to choose." By the 20th day, the house had begun rewriting itself. Not visibly, not like crumbling bricks or shifting walls, but in something far more dangerous. Memory. Dr. Hartwell could no longer trust what he knew. He would walk into a room to retrieve his journal and find the furniture rearranged, the fireplace cold when he remembered it burning, a window bricked over that had always been glass the day before. And worst of all, his own handwriting had changed. Sharper strokes, letters curved like hooks, sentences that he had no recollection of writing, and yet they sounded exactly like him, almost too much like him. One entry chilled him more than any. "The twins are not evolving. We are devolving. The house is thinning us." The twins sat motionless now, eyes locked to the far corners of the room, whispering only when they thought he wasn't there. He heard them say things like, "He used to be someone else. He's folding in. The door under the floor is opening." Hartwell tore up the floorboards in a fevered frenzy. He found no door, but did find bone fragments where the twins had slept. He brought in a local physician, Dr. Bramble, from Roanoke, a skeptical man, rational, secular, but 30 minutes in the house turned him pale. His skin visibly broke out in cold sweat. He refused to touch the twins. On his way out, he whispered, "This is no longer science. This is reclamation. Something wants them back." That night, Hartwell finally confronted the twins. "What are you?" he asked. "You're not children. You're not mine." And they smiled. At the same time, the same grin, and in perfect unison they said, "We are what you forgot." For the first time in his life, Hartwell wept. Not from fear, but recognition. Somewhere deep within, he understood. He had known them before the world taught him to forget. He stared at the wall and saw another version of Ho, himself staring back, emaciated, hollow-eyed, bound in a straitjacket. And written on the wall behind this reflection, scrawled in dried blood, was the phrase, "You already failed once." By the time the first snowfall kissed the edges of the Shiloh pines, Dr. Hartwell could no longer tell if the world outside was real or just another trick of the house. Still, he packed his journals, covered the twins with coats, and loaded them onto the carriage bound for Richmond. He needed perspective, witnesses, sanity. But sanity no longer recognized him. They arrived at the Institute of Physiological Phenomena, a somber grey building filled with rigid men in spectacles and powdered wigs. Hartwell burst into the hall, journals clutched, the twins in tow. "I've brought them," he declared. "Observe. Test. You'll see for yourselves. They're not natural." The room fell silent. One professor stepped forward, brows raised. "You brought whom, Doctor?" Hartwell stepped aside. No one was there. The hallway was empty. He spun, frantic. The coats were on the floor, folded neatly, but the twins were gone. A janitor nearby tilted his head. "You came in alone, sir. Are you well?" "No," Hartwell rasped. "I was never well." He opened his journal to the page with the blood writing, blank. The entry he read aloud the night before, gone. In its place was a crude drawing of two stick figures, identical, holding hands. And beneath it, in childish scrawl, "You tried to leave us again." The doctors tried to calm him. They placed a soft hand on his shoulder and whispered about exhaustion, hysteria, delirium from overwork. But Hartwell knew better. Because as he sat there trying to form words, he heard them, their voices, in the walls, in the air vents, in the breaths of the men questioning him. "You don't get to walk away. You made us. You opened the house. You invited it back." That night, they released Hartwell into the care of a colleague. But when that colleague returned to check on him the next morning, the guest room was cold, empty. On the bed, it was Hartwell's coat, folded neatly, and under it, in a whisper only the most cursed could hear, laughter, twin laughter, soft, eternal, like it had always been there. By the time spring thawed the soil of Buchanan County, the Henderson estate had become a ghost. The house still stood, but the name was whispered only with dread. Farmers avoided the trail that led past the Pine Ridge. Children dared not chase each other near the creek behind the property. The land itself had soured. And then they returned. No carriage, no horse, no witnesses. Just one morning, the door of the manor stood ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. Inside, every lamp was lit, every mirror covered. And in the drawing room sat the twins. Same height, same clothes, same black ribbons, no older, no different. Except now their eyes didn't just watch, they listened. They didn't speak, but the servants who came to investigate fled within minutes, unable to explain why their hands shook or why they wept without knowing why. One man later claimed he heard his own mother's voice, dead 10 years, calling from the shadows of the dining room. Another insisted the twins weren't alone. "They've brought it back," he whispered to the town's preacher. "That thing in the cellar. They walk like children, but they're just doors now." The preacher, Reverend McKinley, led a small group to confront the strange happenings. Bible in hand, cross around his neck, he entered the house and didn't flinch when the door slammed behind him. What he saw inside was never written in any sermon. But we know this. McKinley emerged alone, barefoot, bleeding from his ears, chanting psalms that didn't exist in any version of Scripture. He walked into the woods and was never found again. The town sent no more men, and the manor, it breathed. Windows fogged from the inside. Low humming was heard at dusk, deep, metallic and wrong. At night, travelers swore they saw something standing in the attic window, not a girl, not a ghost, but something in between. A convergence, something ancient that had been invited through those girls, something that needed mirrors covered because reflection was a threat to it, something that could only return through twins, perfect symmetry, human portals. People began to say it wasn't the twins who had come back, it was what watched them, and now it was watching the whole town. The first to vanish was the widow Harriet Blackstone. She lived alone, just 2 miles downriver from the Henderson estate, and was known for her sharp tongue and even sharper memory. She claimed, days before she disappeared, that she saw the twins walking backward through her garden at midnight, feet not touching the ground, eyes glowing like coals under moonlight. When neighbors forced open her door the next morning, they found the kettle boiling, her Bible open on the kitchen table, but no sign of Harriet. Only the deep scratches in the wood floor, as though something had crawled out of it. 2 nights later, the butcher's boy was found wandering the streets, muttering numbers and drawing spirals into the dirt with his fingers. His mother swore he hadn't slept since the twins returned. He had stopped speaking except to whisper, "I see them when I blink. I hear their breath in my teeth." By the end of the week, 13 families had fled Buchanan County, and still, no one dared burn the Henderson estate. One man tried, lit a torch, rode out on horseback, screaming scripture. His horse returned alone, its eyes wide with terror, its hooves soaked in something black that smelled like rotting meat and wet iron. The doctor who examined the horse collapsed shortly after. He died with one word scrawled across his wall in blood, twice. Something was taking root in the town. A slow, invisible sickness, not of the body, but of the mind. Dreams twisted. The clocks lost time. People heard children laughing where no children lived. Even the birds left. The forest, once thick with sound, now stood silent as a church graveyard before burial. And always, the twins remained untouched, still sitting in the parlor, still unmoving. Their black ribbons never frayed, their pale skin never wrinkled. No one saw them eat. No one saw them sleep. The local priest finally admitted what others had feared. This isn't possession, it's not a haunting. He looked into the fire and whispered, "It's replication. Something is trying to become us, and it started with those girls." The question was no longer what happened to the Henderson twins. The question was, what is becoming us through them? In late September of 1851, Dr. Alistair Morrow arrived in Buchanan County. He wasn't from Virginia, not even from the South. He came from Boston, clean-shaven, ivory-suited, and educated in Europe under some of the most skeptical minds of the time. Morrow had spent years debunking seances, exorcisms, spiritualist cults. He called them ritual theater for the frightened peasantry. When he heard about the Henderson twins, he smirked. "Mass hysteria," he wrote in his journal, "nothing more than rural superstition wrapped in Gothic drama. I'll solve it in 3 days." He was wrong. From the moment he stepped onto Henderson soil, the air changed. He noted it. Pressure behind the eyes, like before a storm or a seizure. His instruments failed, compasses spun, mercury thermometers shattered. Even his horse refused to approach the house. Still, he entered. What he found he would never describe directly, but the entries in his journal, those recovered later, were enough to terrify the faculty at Harvard into sealing them away for over a century. One entry simply read, "They are not in time, that's the secret. They sit still, but something behind their eyes moves too fast for this world. It's not possession, it's invasion. The house is adapting to them, not the other way around." Morrow remained in the house for 48 hours. When he returned, his clothes were covered in a fine white powder. His hair had turned completely grey, and his voice, once confident and clear, was reduced to a dry, papery rasp. "I tried to look in the mirror," he whispered to the sheriff, "but I wasn't there, not me, something else. It had my face, but the eyes were older, so much older." He left town the next day. By the time he reached Roanoke, he'd scratched his eyes out with his own fingernails. They found him in a hotel bathtub whispering, "One girl is the key, but the other one is the dude." And he died smiling, as if he'd finally understood something the rest of us were never meant to see. The townsfolk had seen enough. After Dr. Morrow's descent into madness, the whispers turned into roars. No one wanted the Henderson place to stand another day. The preacher declared it an abomination, a gateway to forces that mocked the natural order. Farmers refused to plow the fields nearby. Mothers kept their children indoors at dusk. Even the sheriff, who once mocked the tales, now crossed himself every time he passed the road that led to the house. On October the 3rd, 1851, a group of 20 men gathered before sunrise. Some brought kerosene, Others carried axes. A few came with nothing but crosses and fear. They marched up the hill in silence. The house did not welcome them. It seemed aware. The front door was already open. Inside, the twins sat at the top of the stairs, motionless, watching. The men didn't speak to them, didn't threaten. They simply began pouring the kerosene, along the floors, up the stairs, across the rotting furniture. One man hesitated near the parlor. He swore he saw a child's drawing on the wall change before his eyes. A stick figure with eyes too large, teeth too wide, reaching toward him. He screamed and fled, but the rest carried on. The match was struck. The flames rose and the house screamed. Not wood, not wind. It was a shriek, a howl, like something buried deep beneath the floors was clawing its way up. Windows shattered, walls shuddered, the air turned black with soot, but the fire, instead of spreading, began to vanish, as if it were being swallowed by the house, drained like blood into soil. When the smoke cleared, the house stood intact, unburned, untouched. Only the men had changed. Some fell to their knees, others wept. One man, the local blacksmith, simply walked into the woods and was never seen again. Another collapsed, muttering, "She asked me to let her out, and I almost did." The preacher dropped his bibs, and declared, "This is not wood and stone, this is not of God, this is a body, and we just tried to kill a living thing." The Henderson twins, still sitting, still watching, unmoving, except for their eyes. Their eyes never blinked. The house didn't retaliate with rage, it retaliated with silence. But silence can be far more dangerous than fire. Weeks passed, then months, and yet something was different. Men forgot their chores. Women woke up screaming without knowing why. Infants were born with glassy, vacant stares. The town clock ticked slower. Crops spoiled in one night without rot, as if drained of life. And then the disappearances began. At first, it was a hired hand who failed to return from the Henderson property, then 2 children who had wandered near the stream behind the house, then a horse and rider, both gone, with hoof prints leading into the woods and stopping mid-stride. No one dared organize another burning. You see, it wasn't just fear, it was influence. The house had begun to seep into thoughts. Men started dreaming of the twins, waking up speaking languages they had never learned. One boy, barely 6, sketched the twins perfectly without ever having seen them. A woman tried to drown herself in the town well after claiming, "They showed me the beginning. I want to go back." The local reverend attempted an exorcism from a safe distance, standing in the churchyard with holy water and a rifle. But the next day, his skin peeled from his palms in neat symmetrical strips. He went blind within a week. The town's name faded from maps. Mail stopped arriving. Roads were overgrown faster than nature allowed. One cartographer wrote, "This place rejects orientation. The trees curve backward. The shadows fall wrong." And all the while, the twins remained, unaged, unmoving, unforgiven. Local legend said if you stood at the Henderson gate on a windless night, you could hear children humming, but the tune was always foreign, too harmonic, too inhuman, like a choir tuned to the wrong key of reality. Old man Bearden, the only one who dared live nearby, whispered to a trader, "It's not just a house anymore. It's a lung, breathing in the town, breathing in people, turning them into memory." The trader never made it back to Richmond. His cart arrived, horse still harnessed, but his journal had only one line written on the final page. "The twins do not live in the house lives in them." When the government finally got involved, it wasn't out of compassion, it was out of necessity. Too many reports had leaked, too many strange field notes from geologists, surveyors, and postal agents, all showing signs of psychological collapse. Whispers of a house that listens, land that edits memory, and twins that never die started reaching the desks of military intelligence. That was when a team, unmarked, unnamed, was dispatched from Washington under the guise of rural disease control. But they brought no doctors, just men in dark wool coats, notebooks sealed in wax, and odd equipment that the locals said hummed even when it wasn't plugged in. The few remaining townspeople watched from behind cracked windows as the agents set up camp outside the Henderson property, driving metal rods into the earth in strange, geometric patterns. They were trying to triangulate something, but not a location, a frequency. One night, the experiment escalated. Locals described a pulse rippling through the trees, like the forest took one deep breath in unison. Livestock died instantly. Paint peeled off the church walls. Pregnant women went into premature labor, and the babies didn't cry. They just stared. The government team never exited the house. Not one man. But days later, military trucks returned, not to rescue, but to erase. They sealed off the region with fencing, false flood reports, and quarantine warnings. The town was scrubbed from postal records, census data redacted, maps redrawn with a blank space where the town used to be. Even the railroad that once passed through was rerouted overnight. And just like that, the town was no longer real, except to those who remembered the hum, except to those who dreamt of the twins. A few documents escaped containment, scans of journals, black and white surveillance photos showing the same two girls standing in different windows, in different decades. In one, their hands were pressed flat against the glass. In another, they were smiling. Only the shadows behind them were reaching forward. A whistleblower, later declared insane, testified to Congress in 1897. They're not human. They never were. The house is an organism, and the girls are its neurons. We didn't study them. We woke them. No one ever mentioned the Henderson twins again in any official record, but that doesn't mean they disappeared. Because every 10 years, without fail, someone goes missing in the blank spot of Virginia no map will name. By the turn of the century, the area where the Henderson estate once stood had become a geographic phantom. No official name, no records, and no clear borders. But that didn't stop the legends. Hunters went in chasing deer and came out speaking in languages no one understood. Surveyors saw twin girls walking across dried lake beds that hadn't existed for 50 years. And once, a preacher claimed he followed their voices into a fog and met his younger self in the woods, alive, terrified, and bleeding from both ears. In 1904, a researcher named Dr. Alton Creel, an outcast physicist from Boston, began what he called the echo experiment. He believed the Henderson twins weren't anomalies, but conduits. Not of demons or ghosts, but conscious frequencies, thoughts from a realm older than time, echoing through matter, searching for minds soft enough to mold. And the minds of young children, perfect clay. Creel proposed that the twins were genetic receivers, born under a rare lunar resonance in 1851 that aligned their neurology to a signal buried deep in the Earth's crust. Not geological, not magnetic, but cognitive, a frequency that didn't transmit sound or heat, but ideas. And the Henderson twins, they weren't special because of who they were, but what they heard. He believed the old Henderson home had been built, either by design or accident, on a psychic fault line, a place where past, future, and nightmare existed simultaneously, and he wasn't the only one to think so. Multiple universities tried to acquire the land covertly between 1910 and 1925, but everyone who entered the ruins came back fractured, if they came back at all. One professor was found scribbling words in reverse with both hands. Another stood motionless for 3 days, then whispered, "The girls are just the beginning." He never spoke again. By the 1930s, the area had become a whispered taboo in elite circi. Lairs, a place intelligence agencies monitored but never mentioned, a location where scientific minds went rogue or disappeared. And through it all, the image persisted. 2 girls, hand in hand, standing in a doorway that shouldn't exist, their dresses unstained by time, their eyes reflecting something not human, but older than fear. Because even now, 174 years later, when seismic instruments are placed too close to that cursed soil, they don't measure earthquakes, they measure heartbeats. Twin ones, and they're getting closer. In 1964, an unmarked crate surfaced at an estate auction in Richmond, purchased by an anonymous collector rumored to work within the Department of Psychological Defense, a branch of the U.S. government that officially doesn't exist. Inside the crate were leather-bound journals, warped photographs, and wax-sealed dossiers bearing a single word: replication. The contents were traced to a man named Dr. Silas Venn, a covert neurologist affiliated with post-war mind control programs like MK Ultra. But this wasn't LSD experimentation or Soviet paranoia. Venn had a different obsession: the Henderson frequency. He believed the twins were not the end of a story, but a prototype, a biological success, born from ancient rituals, regional alignments, and selective inbreeding traced through Appalachian bloodlines. His files revealed that over 11 families in Virginia alone were part of an unnamed cultic breeding program, funded by industrialists, protected by corrupt medical boards, and overlooked by local authorities. Venn's records state plainly, the Hendersons were not an accident, they were the first model. The goal wasn't merely control, it was transmission. Venn hypothesized that the twins' minds had been synchronized to a deeper signal, what he called the root pulse, a cognitive energy embedded in Earth's substrata, influencing evolution, behavior, and belief systems throughout human history. He claimed early versions of this pulse had shaped plague outbreaks, religious visions, even mass disappearances. The Hendersons were simply the first children who could withstand the full force of it without immediate neural collapse. But what happened next is worse than silence. Because every person who came into contact with Venn's final files, military researchers, archivists, independent scientists, either died mysteriously or vanished. Some went insane, others committed suicide within 72 hours of reading Protocol Mirror 9, a document never fully recovered. Only fragments remain. One sentence, nearly illegible, read, "The twins were receivers, but the replicas will be broadcasters." If that's true, if somewhere, hidden in basements of psychiatric hospitals or remote compounds, there are children engineered to transmit what the Hendersons once absorbed, then we're not dealing with a mystery. We're staring down a system, not for control, but for replacement. Because what the Hendersons heard, the world may soon begin to speak. In 2006, an investigative team from a private historical research firm, Gideon Archive East, acquired rights to excavate the burned remains of Henderson Hollow, the land once home to the now erased plantation. What they unearthed wasn't ruins, it wasn't ash, it was sealed stone, beneath the roots, beneath time itself. At the base of a twisted oak, dead for decades but unnaturally preserved, they discovered a trap door, ancient but reinforced with modern bolts. Inside was a chamber, dry, cold, untouched by mold. The air was sterile, too sterile. On the walls were dozens of black and white photographs, all depicting children with glassy stares, eyes wide open, each identical to the Henderson twins. Dozens of them. Some pictures dated as recently as 1997. The twins had not aged, but it wasn't just photos. On an altar of stone was a journal, handwritten in archaic script. The last line read, "The host shall not die, it shall scatter." What followed was worse than any horror, a sound. As they left the chamber, the crew's audio equipment recorded a high-frequency hum, like a whisper stretched over static. Audio technicians who reviewed it later described feelings of nausea, panic, and waking hallucinations. One of them, a 29-year-old ex-military analyst, jumped from a 7th-story window 2 days later, screaming about the echo inside the mirror. Within a month, Gideon Archive East ceased operations. The remaining researchers vanished. Their digital trail was wiped clean. Their families offered government silence and private settlements. And here's the twist no one talks about. A new housing development was constructed right over that land. Sold cheap, no permits were ever reviewed. And within 2 years, 3 families reported that their children were speaking in unison, speaking at night, describing visions of fire, stone rooms, and the others beneath the trees. Oh, Neboy reportedly drew a symbol in crayon on every wall of their house, an eye split by a cross. It matched a sigil found on the original Henderson gravestone. But let's be clear, this isn't just a ghost story, it's a transmission. If the Henderson twins were the first, if replication succeeded, then somewhere out there today, a child is listening, and someday soon, he may answer. So the next time you see twins staring too long, the next time a child draws symbols you've never taught, or the mirror fogs with no one around, ask yourself, was it just your mind, or are they still watching, still waiting for the next body to echo their design? Because this isn't folklore. It's a system. Buried, suppressed, still active. And the Henderson twins? They were just the first draft. Subscribe to Unholy Word, where we rip open America's darkest secrets, one sealed grave at a time.